speaker is Saul Kripke, professor at the City University of New York, where he has affiliations also both in the philosophy and the computer science department. Professor Kripke has given groundbreaking contributions in metaphysics, the philosophy of language, mathematical logic, and several other areas. And a little bit more than 35 years ago, he published a book, Kripkenstein on Rules and Private Language, which basically, a little bit more than 37.
37?
37.
Wow.
37, yeah. And so that book basically shaped the rule-following debate as we know it nowadays. And today is gonna revisit that book. So.
Okay. I do apologize to the professionals, or well, maybe other people are professionals too, but I mean the ones who've come to this conference, the sorts of criticisms of me that I am discussing. I mean, I thought I really should update this old paper. We haven't done so. And yeah, I was glad to hear, to notice, unless that was self-selecting because of people attending the workshop, none of the things that the criticisms of me that I'm going to discuss in this were represented in the conference, and rightly, right? And rightly. But I don't know. Romina said, look, other people will be here. They will be interested anyway, right? And I hope that is true. I really thought maybe we should update it to something more sophisticated on the level of the other speakers, but we haven't done so, right? Okay, right. We did talk about it, but yeah. There were time and other considerations. Okay, actually, I suppose I can see what I've written so far. All right, so we can go to the next slide. Let me begin with a remark David Lewis made to me personally many years ago. I will say, you know, David Lewis has figured in several of the other papers his account of conventions and of natural right properties and so on, right? So that is all interesting. Anyway, he was talking about people who say that my exegesis of Wittgenstein is wrong, right? So his remark concerns the relevance of any exegetical issue over my reading of Wittgenstein, or even the more modest exegetical statement made in my book when I say that it should be thought of expounding neither Wittgenstein's argument nor Kripke's, rather than Wittgenstein's argument as it struck Kripke, as it presented a problem for him. David Lewis remarked, in any case, that the skeptical problem I found from Wittgenstein is clearly interesting in and of itself. He was reacting to some critics who claimed that Wittgenstein's intentions were completely different. And then he added, if Wittgenstein didn't say that, so much the worse for him, right? This was an actual conversation we had, and we didn't always agree, so yeah, right, so we did agree, yeah, right.
Mostly not.
Mostly not, right, yeah. Okay, now in agreeing with David about this, and indeed it's suggesting that the skeptical problem that struck me from the rule following considerations is one that personally I'm inclined to regard as the most radical and original skeptical problem that philosophy has seen to date, one that only a highly unusual cast of mind could have produced. Okay, I am already violating one of Baker and Hacker, they wrote a long commentary on the investigations, but they also wrote a highly polemical criticism of my book, right? I suppose it's really Hacker's style. He's still alive and he still writes in this sort of, these guys are just idiots, sort of style of polemic to this day. I mean, and I'm certainly not the only victim of this. Okay, right? Okay, now, one of Baker and Hacker's dicta, the point is independent of the exegetical merits of my interpretation, which of course Baker and Hacker also dispute. And no doubt they think the real Wittgenstein had a much better view. Water. In their book, Skepticism, the Rules in Language, that's enough. Baker and Hacker give an elaborate cultural analysis of how in 17th century culture, given the challenge to Christianity and the scientific revolution, philosophical skepticism could be an interesting problem. But we may want to ask, didn't Hume write in the 18th century? Yeah. Weren't some skeptical problems raised already in ancient Greece? I also must say in my own introduction, self-introduction to philosophy, where I asked my father, look, maybe we're just having a dream now. But I was somehow not in contact with the right culture, right? He told me that when I got older, I could read Descartes, and I found the book in his library. See, right? That got me into philosophy. That's the true story. Okay, right. Okay. They declare in any case that these are not the problems of the 20th century, nor of the 21st, I suppose. Achievement in philosophy today could not consist in inventing new forms of skepticism, because this is the wrong culture somehow, right? They cite a lengthy list of authors and artists, as well as disciplines, who are supposed to prove their point, and I'm sure they have read more authors and gone to art galleries than I have, if they want to say that, right? Some of these authors, however, such as Orwell and Borges, do seem to me to be concerned with philosophical skepticism, though they're actually on their list of people who are not concerned with this, right? Okay, right. Now, well, I certainly hope people have not taken this silly piece of dogmatism seriously. Indeed, in the 20th century, Bertrand Russell is usually credited with raising the skeptical question of whether the universe might have been created 5 minutes ago, right? So I've already elaborated on this point for too long, but before moving on, let me warn all those students and professors in the pursuit of philosophical achievement, we would better stay away from inventing new forms of skepticism. Okay. Okay. Who knows what the 21st century, well, we're in it now, right? And maybe someone will invent a new form of skepticism, right? My own exegetical claims in the book are fairly modest. I claim to be presenting Wittgenstein's argument as it struck me, so hence people use the term Kripkenstein or whatever, right? But in spite of this remark, this book does profess to be an exposition of Wittgenstein's views, even though I disclaim that Wittgenstein himself would wish them expounded in this way. Note, however, that in footnote 7, page 6, I have to look, right, I give some indication of how much I think of my discussion is due to me and how much I think is textually ascribable to Wittgenstein himself. I would have to look that up myself, right? In particular, the treatment of the dispositional theory And the simplicity objection is cases where the arguments given in Wittgenstein's path are mainly due to me, though inspired by his writings, or in the case of simplicity, at least consistent with their spirit. Now, the dispositional theory doesn't mean what Professor Zuni has advocated, right? Okay. Some critics have said that I don't give enough citations to the investigations to support my interpretation. I mean, my intent, especially except when things are explicitly cited, was that readers should figure out the connection for themselves. After all, Wittgenstein himself thought that philosophy should not be spoon-fed, and others have thought this a proper and illuminating procedure. Okay, I could have given more references, actually, but I mean, yeah.
Tell them the spoon-fed thing.
Oh, that was something Anscombe. No, I was saying to her, look, can't you sometimes get annoyed by the obscurity of, this was an actual conversation with Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe, who was, of course, a leading disciple of Wittgenstein, right? So I said, can't you just find this obscure style somewhat annoying, right? And she said, well, yes, Wittgenstein said that philosophy should not be spoon-fed, right? I guess meaning made too easy to read, right? Of course, some people, probably not in the analytic community, have thought that it's a mark of serious philosophy that it should be highly obscure, right? Kant was something of a transitional figure towards creating this, right? I don't think he was so much trying to be obscure, but then we got what we now call continental philosophy, where that's almost part of the idea. Okay, well, anyway, in general, I urge the reader to look at my book in conjunction with reading the relevant parts in the investigations and parallel passages in the remarks on the foundations of mathematics are also relevant. In the course of this talk, however, I will recommend and try to comment on some relevant passages from Wittgenstein's writings. But let me say at the outset that I do not think that that any critics, well, I mean, I don't know, I've read any further critics than when I was reading this, have shown that my interpretation is basically an incorrect exegesis. I mean, it might be, but one can't really say. Okay, right. Now, as I hope everyone knows, in the book I ascribe a certain skeptical problem to Wittgenstein. We're all familiar with the book, so I won't get into the details of the problem. Yet I do, I guess, right? But since I am speaking to a more general audience, to make sure we are all on the same page, let me begin with a brief summary of the skeptic's challenge. We will pay special attention to the conditions that a proper answer needs to be met, and to the abilities that we are granted by the skeptic. So set up is this. When confronted with the computation of 68 plus 57, I am certain that it ought to yield the result 125. I have never added numbers greater than 57 in the past. Notice that even though it is unlikely that I've never added numbers greater than 57, everyone certainly has computed a finite number of additions, so that some number exceeds them all. I have sometimes thought the example might be made better if someone, switches to computations in a different base above, right, to a certain level, right, rather than this simple-minded 5 thing, right? Like to base 12. I mean, I actually once was given a real puzzle where that was what was going on, right? You can Oh, you're continuing the sequence? What? No, what's happening? Say, right. But they actually switched from base 10 to base 12 is what was happening. Right. Okay, all right. Okay. 125 is the correct answer in the arithmetical sense. 125 is the sum of 68 plus 57. It is also the correct answer in the metalinguistic sense. Plus, as I intended to use this word in the past, denotes a function that yields 125 when applied to 68 and 57. A skeptic comes along and questions the metalinguistic sense. As I use the term plus in the past, I should respond 5. Okay. Since I never performed this particular computation, what I should do is to apply the function or rule for plus that I have applied in the past. Problem, for all I know, I might have been applying the following function. Plus y equals x plus y if x, y are less than 57 equals 5 otherwise. So, of course, speakers here are all very familiar with this, and maybe other people are too. The skeptic claims, or I say in the book, feigns to claim that I'm misinterpreting my past uses. I always meant plus. When I compute, I take myself to be following directions or rules that I've given myself in the past that uniquely determine what the answer should be. In this case, 125. As I am fond of saying, I don't take my answers to be a leap in the dark. Actually, that comes from Wittgenstein. Am I justified in being so confident? Answering the skeptic. Skeptic challenges whether there is a fact that I meant plus and not plus. I have reason to be confident in my answer, 125. Plainly, 1 and 2 are related. It is because I am confident that I meant plus that I have reason to be sure that 125 and not 5 is the correct answer. So an answer must, 1, give an account of a fact about my mental state or external behavior that constitutes my meaning plus and not quas. And this fact must show that I am justified in answering 125 in terms of my previous intent. There are also some basic rules that we must take into consideration. So these are, 1, the accuracy of my computation and my memory are not under dispute. B, this is not a skeptical problem about arithmetic. It is, even though the skeptical challenge is formulated in mathematical terms, it applies to the whole of language. Recall my example of a table. A table might say that in all cases I meant table, where a table is a table not found at the base of the Eiffel Tower or a chair found there. Or maybe a table could be a table before some date. Today. Oh, wow, yeah. Did you just put that?
Yes.
And a chair after that. I mean, someone in a previous talk mentioned a Berkeleyan idea of an observable, right, table, right? And maybe, if not observable, a chair, something like that could be, right? Okay, well, similar examples could be given for a wide variety of terms. Common language. The skeptic is not questioning my present use of plus. He agrees that 68 plus 57 denotes 125. Now, eventually, of course, the present usage is coming under question too, but in order to be able to talk about this at all, we're not questioning the present usage, right? He is only questioning whether my present use of plus agrees with my past uses. Thus, the skeptic and I agree on our present uses of plus, at least at the beginning, and only past uses are questioned. Eventually, it will apply to all uses. That's what I was just saying, present and future. If there was nothing in the past that constituted my meaning plus rather than quest, there can't be anything in the present or the future that constitutes it either. The skepticism then applies to the whole of language and all my uses. Yes. Okay, there are no behavioristic limitations on the facts that can be cited. I'm mentioning this because Quine on the indeterminative translation is a skeptic about meaning and even about extension. It's not his usual distinction with this, right? But also his grounds are behavioristic. Appeal to inner mental states is fair game, as long as they're not described in terms of intentions and meanings, right, or whatever, right? Recall the skeptic claims that even if God could look into my mind, he wouldn't find the relevant fact. This is something of a quotation. In the Investigations Part 2, I guess in the new edition they don't call it Part 2 anymore, right? But it doesn't matter too much. Kripkenstein says, if God had looked into my minds, he would not have been able to see there whom we were speaking of. It is important to remember that the skeptical problem is constitutive rather than epistemic. The challenge only appears to be epistemological. The skeptic allows perfect recall of my complete mental history and past behavior. And if there is nothing in my internal mental history or external behavior that shows that I meant plus, then it will seem that there is no fact that establishes what I meant. Thus, the challenge that started as an epistemological question about whether anyone can know what I meant by plus is in the end a constitutive or metaphysical problem about whether is there any such state of plus denoting any one function or another. So the question is, what state of mind can there be that tells me how to follow a rule, not how we know something or what evidence we have for it? And it strikes me as hard to deny that Wittgenstein indeed raises such a skeptical problem. I especially recommend, and will comment on some of the investigations, I give some sections and then some sections parallel to this in the remarks on the foundations of mathematics. But but of course lots else in both those books is relevant. I guess the remarks were not really worked up for publication. Okay, consider 185 and 186. There, Wittgenstein is discussing the case of a pupil who, judged by the usual criteria, has mastered the natural numbers. He says, now we teach him to write down down other series of cardinal numbers and get him to the point of writing down series of the form. By the way, I think this usage did exist in math papers. I mean, like in Gödel's 1931 paper, this use of series. Nowadays, they would speak of a sequence or Folge in German, right? Not a series or Reihe in German, right? Which is like 1 plus 1/2 and so on, right? But so he uses series in this other way, and I think maybe people did in some older days. Because, I found it, say, in Gödel's paper, famous 0n, 2n, 3n, etc., in the form plus n. I was just saying this stuff about Folke because once I was talking about this to a mathematical friend, and he said, what, series? No, right, Okay, so at the order +1, he writes down the series of natural numbers. Let us suppose we've done exercises and given tests up to 1,000, right? Then we get the people to continue one series, say, plus 2 beyond 1,000, and he writes 1,000, 1,004, 1,008, 1,012. We say to him, look what you've done. He doesn't understand. We say, you were meant to add 2. Look, I can't see it myself. Okay, look how you began the series. He answered, yes. Isn't it right? I thought that why I was meant to do it. Or suppose he pointed to this series and said, but I went on in the same way. It would now be no use to say, but you can't you see? And repeat the old explanations, examples and explanations. In such a case, we might say, perhaps, it comes natural to this person to understand the order with explanations as we should understand the order. Add 2 up to 1,000, 4 up to 2,000, 6 up to 3,000, and so on. Such a case would present similarities in the one in which a person naturally reacted to the gesture of pointing with the hand by looking in the direction of the line from fingertip to wrist, not from wrist to fingertip. So I think this is Wittgenstein's and also one of his own examples, right? Yeah. Oh, what you're saying then comes to this: a new insight, intuition is needed at every state to carry out the order plus n correctly. To carry it out correctly, how is it decided? What is the right step to take at any particular stage? The right step is the one that accords with the order as it was meant. So when you gave the order plus 2, you meant that he was to write 1, 2, 1,002 after 1,000. Do you also mean he would write 1868 after 1866? And what is that? One. Is that, yeah, okay, is it 100,000? I think it's 1 mil. I know, there are too many zeros. 1 million, it's 100,000, you think? 36?
100,036.
Yes, after 100,034, and so on. An infinite number of such propositions. You see how difficult it is to think of them all, since I couldn't do it myself. Okay, now, what I meant was he should write the next one number after any number he wrote, and from this, all these propositions follow in turn. But that's just what is in question. What at any stage does follow from the sentence? You see, like how Romina's paper about Aryan adoption is really, what really follows, right? Or and again, what at any stage we're to call being in accord with that sentence, and with the meaning you put into that sentence, whatever that may have consisted in. It would be almost more correct to say not that an intuition was needed at every stage, but that a new decision was needed at every stage. So that does seem more appropriate, right, if that were right. Now, this is not my own plus example, but it's very similar in flavor, and indeed somewhat simpler. It's more like the change of base sort of idea or whatever, right? These passages and the following ones develop the problem of how one can determine in advance what is meant by a given rule. Notice his use of right in 186. I'm not sure what, I have not looked that up. I should have looked it up.
Well, 186, we just did it. Maybe I can go back.
Oh, that was...
He's saying it. Yeah. 186, right. I don't know what. Yeah, the right step.
Oh, yeah, it's the one that accords with the order. Okay. You see how I don't know my own stuff, so. These passages and the following ones develop the problem of how one can determine in advance what is meant by a given rule. Notice his use of right in 186. And in my view, they already suggest that Wittgenstein is raising a skeptical problem. Now, I don't see, I don't need to, I think, persuade most of the speakers here, but consider also a significant parallel passage from the remarks, page 1. How do I know that in working out the series plus 2, I must write 2004, 2006, and not 2004, 2008? So that's the same kind of thing. The question, how do I know that this color is red, where red is in single quotation marks, is similar, right? This explicitly connects the mathematical case with the problem of recognizing a type of visual impression, or that it should be so called anyway. I mean, sometimes the way he puts it might look, I mean, there's a use mention or church translation problem, the way he puts it, but here the thing is in single quotes.
That paragraph was important to you historically, right?
Oh, you mean that I realized? Yes. Yes, that's right. That I thought, oh, you know, all the stuff about sensation language. Of course, you wouldn't call red a sensation, but an internal impression, but the same kind of thing, right? Okay. Yeah. The passage, which I've taken to be about visual impressions, not external colors, well, then the question is whether it suggested to me the treatment of these two different cases was in fact an application of the more general rule-following problem. Now, just as in my plus case, one might attempt to clarify here what is meant by appealing to additional instructions. For example, we did not learn to add from a finite number of examples and extrapolate the whole function to the whole function. We learned a rule explaining what addition is. So, I mean, maybe I should have said more about decimal numbers, which I do say in another paper on the natural numbers, but in this, I thought of it as like primitive. In this book, I thought of addition explained by taking together two disjoint heaps and saying their sum is their union, right? But this too is susceptible of interpretations. What is meant by disjoint? What is union? All these are susceptible of different interpretations. And the answer should be independent. If I say the answer should be independent of the size of the heaps, can't that be interpreted as quindependent? Where quindependent is defined to mean independent up to heaps of a certain size, but not for larger ones. The point is, of course, also emphasized by Wittgenstein, for example, in the investigations 197, 198, and 201, which is a passage I emphasize a lot. We might give one interpretation after another to explain what we should do to follow a rule, but this is clearly unsuccessful. A rule for interpreting a rule, reducing one rule to a more basic one, doesn't stop the skeptical replies. Now, regarding 201, some writers, not in this conference, right, have criticized me vehemently for quoting only part of it. Here's the whole paragraph. This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule because every course of action can be made to accord with the rule. So this in the answer was, if everything can be made out to accord with the rule, then it also made out to be conflicted. So there would be neither accord nor conflict here. Okay, it can be seen, this is the part that I supposedly failed to quote. In the misunderstanding here, for the mere fact that in the course of our argument we give one interpretation after another, well, as if each one contented us for a moment until we thought of yet another standing behind it. What this shows here is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but is exhibited in what we call following the rule and going against it in actual cases. Now, hence there is an inclination to say every action according to a rule is an interpretation, but we ought to restrict the term interpretation substitution of one expression of the rule to another, right? Now, of course, I regard the rest of the paragraph, that is, the last two paragraphs, as discussing in part what I call the skeptical solution as well as the paragraphs immediately before 201 and 202 after it. And it was just a matter of the organization of the book, right? Was to set up the paradox first as a problem, only then to discuss the skeptical solution. I naturally did not quote the whole context, including the rest of 201 in the beginning. There were some authors, and I said, "Oh, I do not quote, I even pay no heed." One writer wrote to McGinn. Yeah, he's in more trouble these days. Okay, right. Yeah, in fact, I only allude to the regressive interpretations in this paragraph, giving my own exposition of it. Let me turn for a moment to number 238. In the received translation, this paragraph says, the rule can only be seen to me to produce all of its consequences in advance if I draw them as a matter of course. Now there's a new translation by Hacker and Schulte, I guess his name is, right? But they preserve this, right? As much as it's a matter of course for me to call this color blue, criteria for the fact that something is a matter of course for me. The translation as a matter of course sounds simply too behavioral to me, though perhaps it is possible. So I just said it's been retained. The German original is müssen Sie mir selbstverständlich sein. That is, it must be obvious to me, right? It's an epistemic, not just a behavioral notion, right? Or even more literally, of course, it'd be self-evident to me, but that may carry philosophical baggage about self-evident truths and stuff like that. So obvious is right. But the point is epistemic, not simply behavioral. That's the main thing I wish to say about this passage, right? So similarly in 231, but surely you can see, that is the characteristic expression of someone who is under the compulsion of a rule, right? The skeptical paradox is simply what is being called self-evident or obvious may not really be self-evident or obvious, as given in the example in 185 about plus 2, and so on, right? Okay, right? Not to everyone. However, look at the strange fantasy in paragraph number 234. Would it be possible for us, however, to calculate it as we all do, all agreeing and so on, and still at every step have a feeling of being guided by the rules as by a spell, feeling astonishment at the fact that we agreed? We might give thanks to the deity for our agreement.
That's the phrase that you referred to the other day, yesterday,
Yeah.
actually, about God.
Oh, well, there's something, if God had looked into our minds.
No. But yesterday, arguing that he was kind of a relativist.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
you mentioned this passage yesterday.
yeah. The fantasy seems to be in strange contrast to the picture given in 238, just quoted, and only 4 paragraphs later, right, where we think it's obvious. It's obvious that the view in 238 is the natural one, and that Wittgenstein thinks that it is. But the fantasy in 234, if it is possible, seems to hold that our confidence in the obvious of the way we follow rules might simply be accidental. And it's imaginable that we could view our practices in another way. Let me get back to the passages beginning in number 185 we mentioned before. Number 191 is as if we could grasp the whole use of the word in a flash. Like what? Can the use in a certain sense be grasped in a flash? And in what sense can it not? The point is that if we could grasp it in a flash, in yet another and much more direct sense than that. But have you a model for this? No, it is just the expression suggests itself to us. as the result of the crossing of different pictures. You have no model of this superlative fact, but you're seduced into using a super expression. I think the New Translation says inordinate fact, doesn't matter. It might be called a philosophical superlative. Now, ultimately, Wittgenstein's skeptical solution and his general attitude in other paragraphs show that the superlative fact is something that we're imposing on ordinary rule followers. But it is hard to see, or at least for me to see, that it is simply a philosophical idea that is imposed on some people. Anyone who reflects on the matter must see that the picture of this superlative fact is one that comes very naturally to us without being given a philosophical lecture, right? That is, you get it now, right? These last remarks already suggest that Martin Kusch is right to say at the very beginning of his book that Kripke is trying to make Wittgenstein's ideas as strong and convincing as possible without, however, committing himself to their truth. This book, that is Kusch's book, which is quite a good book, right, is bolder or more foolhardy, seems to say the position Kripke attributes to Wittgenstein is the right one. Okay. When I attribute to Wittgenstein a non-factualism about our grasp of the rule, I mean this in a very thick sense of fact, as given just now in number 192. This came up yesterday. Yeah. In spite of Wittgenstein's own apparent attitude, as expressed elsewhere in the investigations, the picture in 192 seems very natural to me. Its naturalness is in effect related to passages I've just quoted about the feeling of obviousness attached to following a rule. In spite of some passages from Wittgenstein claiming that the superlative fact is simply something imposed by philosophers, it is hard for me to see that this is so. On the contrary, as some other passages might suggest, it seems to me to be a very natural feeling for most of us. And that is why, unlike Kusch and perhaps some others, it is hard for me to convince of Wittgenstein's views, for me to be convinced of Wittgenstein's views as I've understood them. Of course, there are some other sophisticated things proposed by various speakers that might help, right, to geo-coordination problems, whatever, right, or, Professor Azuni's, okay, dispositional. I suppose I should admit that after all, I myself am seduced by such superlative facts. There are some passages in my book where some of my reservations about this are expressed. For example, I say, sometimes when I've contemplated the situations, I have had something of an eerie feeling. Even now as I write, I feel confident that there's something in my mind, the meaning I attach to the plus sign, that instructs me what I ought to do in all future cases. I do not predict what I will do. And then I say something right after this, but instruct myself what I ought to do to conform to the meaning. But this does not mean that I really have a model for a superlative fact that I must reject Wittgenstein's deflationary account, or that I have a convincing argument to do so. I do mean that the feeling is not simply imposed by philosophers, as some people, maybe Wittgenstein himself, when he sometimes thinks. I do think that, however, that many of the replies to Wittgenstein, as I am presenting him, of course, do fail. And I'd like to say something about one that has been very influential, Fodor's attempt to rehabilitate the sophisticated version of the dispositional response. Let me say right away, since there was this one previous paper by Professor Azuni at This has little to do with his dispositional theories, as we actually discussed, right? So, okay. But this was something by Jerry Fodor in the old days. Recall the basic idea behind the simple version of this proposal. If I am disposed to answer 125 when asked about the sum of 68 and 57, I mean addition by plus. If I am disposed to answer 5, I mean quaddition by plus or by for present uses. I meant that in the past, if I had asked about the sum of 68 and 57, I would have said 125. My actual mental states and replies do not account for my past uses, but there was a disposition in place nonetheless. Now, in reply to the objection that dispositions are finite, and therefore there would be numbers too big for me to have any genuine disposition to add, the dispositionalist may want to upgrade his view to a sophisticated version of this response. As I say, this has little to do with what Professor Azuni was advocating, as came clear in the discussion. What matters is what I am disposed to answer in ideal circumstances. I mean, it isn't only Jerry Fodor, but a bunch of people who think that this is the answer, right?
Michael thinks that Jerry Fodor's reply was right.
Yeah, I was thinking of Michael and their co-author. They shouldn't. Sternly, yeah, they're not even. Serenyi?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think they shouldn't write such an opinionated elementary textbook introduction, right? Stating all sorts of views is to be accepted as part of learning the philosophy of language. That's just another objection, but all right. Anyway, they think that this is right. What matters is what I am disposed to answer in ideal circumstances where supposedly my dispositions can be arbitrarily large. So in this version, the proposal includes a ceteris paribus clause that imagines what I would do if my life were long enough and my brain and body powerful enough to do arbitrarily large calculations. But how do we know what would happen to us if all this were true? The speculations about this are meaningless unless they are simply euphemistic ways of putting the fact that I do mean addition by plus. Notice that it would be plainly circular if the ceteris paribus clause were simply that the relevant idealization would simply be that if these things were so, the answer I get would be the one that I meant. Commentators on my book, which says this, simply cut this part of the passage and say that if I were right, all kinds of idealization in science would be improper. Fodor says, apparently, and as we say, my own even current colleague and admirer of much of my stuff, right? Michael Devitt thinks this is right. Apparently, Kripke assumes that we can't have reason to accept that a generalization defined for idealized conditions is lawful unless we can specify the counterfactuals which would be true if the idealized conditions were obtained. It is hard, however, to see why one should take this methodology seriously. For example, God only knows what would happen if molecules and containers actually meant the conditions specified by the ideal gas laws. Molecules are perfectly elastic, containers infinitely permeable, etc. Well, actually, I suppose in some way there is a prediction as to what would happen, but all right, never mind. But that is not required in order that the ideal gas laws should be in scientific good repute, that we know anything like all of what would happen if there really were ideal gases. All that's required is that we know e.g. that if there were ideal gases, then ceteris paribus, their volume would vary inversely with the pressure upon them. And that counterfactual, the theory itself tells us is true. Similarly, if there are psychological laws that idealize to unbounded working memory, it is not required for them to be in good scientific good repute that all we know what would happen if working memory were unbounded. All we need to know is that if we did have unbounded memory, then ceteris paribus, we would be able to compute the value of m plus n for arbitrary m and n. So there's the reference to Fodor's book and Cush's quotation of it. Now, Cush has an elaborate discussion of the ideal gas laws and why they are in a body of theory. As he says, they are part of the kinetic molecular theory of gases and can be tested to an approximation. He also points out that actual science, in this very case, tries to formulate laws that will be less idealized so that the idealized law becomes more predictively accurate. So, that is, we do take into account, some of the things that are supposed to be ignored in the idealized thing and see how they would work, right? This is obviously true, like of falling bodies and, whether they should be thought of falling in a vacuum or, we take into account, say, air pressure or whatever, right? So now what would be a corresponding deionization in the Fodor case? Wouldn't it be back to where we started? And more importantly, what body of theory is Fodor's law supposed to be a part of? Fodor's law is the mathematics or psychology? Presumably the latter, it would seem to me. I mean, what else could it be? Can we imagine any real psychological theory that makes idealized predictions of what we would do with the enormous numbers involved and lifespan of the subject? It is hard to see exactly what conditions would be sufficient for Fodor's law to hold. Cush emphasizes that the enormous numbers that could be involved, greater than the atoms of the universe, or even this number to its own power, that is, the number of atoms of the universe to its own power. Is there any real psychological theory that says something about this? Nor does the supposed psychological theory, as stated, say anything about the problem of making mistakes. However, it is modified to do so, as Cush discusses, and where we do not worry about speculations about enormous numbers. The resulting laws stated as idealizations would properly put in exceptions if they were known, if this is supposed to be a real psychological theory of dispositions and so on, right? Yeah. Now, there is one theory usually classified as mathematics that has quality something like what Fodor is looking for. This is Turing's theory of a computing machine. Now, this is interesting because though it is mathematics, it intends to be analysis of what a human computer, Wittgenstein himself actually says somewhere, what is a Turing machine? A human being, right? Well, because it is supposed to be analysis, unfortunately computer seems to imply computing machines. But so some people writing of Turing's original paper spell it OR because it is supposed to be an analysis of what a human who computes can do, right? That is what it's supposed to be, right? And it depends partly on idealization and partly on the opposite. On the one hand, Turing, pointing to the limitations of human memory and visual capacity, assumes that there are only finitely many primitive symbols someone can recognize. No specific upper bound is given, but he seems to assume that there is one, right? And he also stresses that if some finite sequences of symbols are very long, we would have to compare them, ticking off one against the other, right? One by one, right? Okay, right? On the other hand, so this is where there is idealization, he recognizes no limitations of time or space for the computation, which is on an infinite tape. There are directions as to what is to be done at each step. Now, I will say there is a modern theory. It still involves a lot of idealization, but it proposes some sort of temporal limitations, like what can be computed in polynomial time, so on. You know, from this point of view, even the propositional calculus is not obviously decidable, right? In fact, that's the famous case of satisfiability problem. Okay, but people, a lot of the things in this field are simply unknown, right? I mean, okay, well, let me not go into this. Okay, it is clear that what is being computed depends on the intentions of whoever is giving the instructions, which must be finite in number. I'm going back to Turing and not talking about the other theory. It should be clear that Turing's analysis, which argues that anything a human might compute can be computed when one is in machines, is a sort of idealized machine I discuss in the book, itself an abstract mathematical object, and assumed correct only in virtue of the program it is set up with. Wittgenstein himself says about it, it's an abstract mathematical object. Wittgenstein says about machines, it does not help us with the skeptical problem. Wittgenstein talks about the difference between the abstract mathematical logic and the actual physical machines that may break down or not be able to do things that are too large and so on, right? That's not just me, it's him too. It should be considered a normative theory in myself, telling us what should be done to follow a given set of instructions. It should also could all be mentioned that in all Wittgenstein's discussions of mathematical rules, it is taken for granted that we can compute each step, even though the work of Turing and Church shows, in fact, there are many other functions that cannot be computed. So, well, I don't know if do I say more about this? Wittgenstein does not consider such functions and rules. It is difficult to see why. Now, I think he probably, if confronted with such things, then it was not that he had never heard of them, right? So, and I don't know what he thought about it. They would have to be defined in terms of other more basic terms, right? Like, the function which is zero if such and such is a theorem of quantification theory, is one if it is a theorem and zero. Otherwise, one has to then talk about the more basic rules of what is a proof in quantification theory, right? And then it's not being one. Of course, that is something he considers a bit of a problem, whether, he has some sort of, okay, well, that's like intuitionists about excluded middle in such cases, but okay. I want to emphasize at the end that Wittgenstein's skeptical solution involves a framework of people interacting with each other. Now, maybe it shouldn't have had to be. Professor Azuni was giving another one. Most of the speakers did take that and even, applied like Lewis's and Thomas Schelling's analyses of coordination games, right, and so on, right, as giving some more rigorous treatment of this. It is, of course, not constitutive of the meaning of when anyone says that what she says agrees with the community. The point is rather that we cannot imagine rule following and hence reasoning in general, except that it depends on a community who agree with each other. Now, that is what he thinks anyway. Those who deviated from an accepted basic rules of the community either can be understood in a non-standard way or must be corrected. as Wittgenstein says in 199, to obey a rule, to make a report, to give an order to play a game of chess are customs, uses, institutions, and so on. Look, I'm just emphasizing this because some people, once again, this guy whose name should not be mentioned anymore, right, thinks I was very wrong. He doesn't say anything about the community, right? But in fact, he does say in these passages, I mean, Kusch gives an examination of the German words, which he says do imply a community of people, right? And actually, I think the English is like the German in each case, except perhaps Gebräuche. I don't know, though I'm not even sure that the English is different there, right? Finally, consider the following paragraphs. Disputes do not break out among mathematicians, say, over the question whether a rule has been obeyed or not. People don't come to blows over it, for example. This is part of the framework on which the working of our language is based, for example, in giving descriptions. So you're saying that human agreement decides what is true and what is false? It is what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language they use. This is not agreement in opinions, but in form of life. He actually goes on to say that, all right, I guess I shouldn't digress from what I've actually been. Obviously, when we say something is such that 1002 comes after 1000, in the series plus 2, we don't mean something involving consulting anyone else. It is important for our technique of ascribing truth and false error to such things that are part of a community who agree in what they say, and you don't consult anyone else, right? This, according to my interpretation of Wittgenstein, is fundamental to our being able to ascribe correctness to each other. Oh, that's it? Wow.
Okay, any questions?
I want to ask a question about something you didn't talk about. I hope it's okay.
Oh, well.
So following the publication of your book, there was an outpouring of work on the normativity of meaning. So one of the things you talk about in the book is, certain things that means, we make it the case that we ought to do and things like that. And there were certain people who read those claims very strongly, so that we were supposed to understand meaning, and it was almost like a premise or intuition of the book that meaning involved a strong kind of normativity. Then there were other readings that were much weaker, which said that, there are certain very weak senses in which meaning is normative, like, the fact that red means what it does makes it the case that there are certain correct applications of it, correct only in the weakest sense, like, it would be the thing to do, it would be the way to apply the word if you wanted to apply the word consistently with the way that it was meant.
Yeah.
So it was a very, very weak, toned down conception of normativity there. And so one of the things I've always wondered is, did you have a view about which of those things held, or which ones you thought you were attributing to Wittgenstein, given that your work is the origin of this, this debate between different ways of thinking about the strength of normativity of meaning?
Yeah, well, I probably just meant it in the simple sense that, well, I don't know what the thicker one would be, that, if we want to apply the word red correctly, then we apply it, I suppose, to those things that appear to be red or internal impressions of red. And if you want to apply it +2 or something like that correctly, this is what you should do, right? And that's fairly simple, I think, yeah. Now, yeah, I would have to look at whatever these thicker senses are to see whether.
What do you mean what do you mean when you say what he attributed to Wittgenstein? Like what Wittgenstein was criticizing, or what Wittgenstein came up with?
I just, taking the book to be, an attempt to read Wittgenstein as a problem for Kripke, so there's certain claims about, what ought, means ought, what we ought to do given certain means made in the book, and I didn't want to attribute anything to Professor Kripke himself. I was just curious, there's a problem presented in the book, and these ought claims following from these statements are part of the statement of that problem, and so I was just
Yes.
Because I mean
that's all I meant with that edge.
Yeah.
He's talking about Kripkenstein rather than
Yeah.
Kripke, that's all.
because the notion that comes out of the solution is clearly a watered down
Yeah.
notion of normativity with respect to what one was hoping for.
Yes, right. But I mean, even if what one was hoping for, it would just be this, that, right? To follow what was meant. I mean, this is what he's questioning, right?
Right.
This is what one should do in these simple cases, right? And then the more complex cases will come out of them, right? I suppose, is that yeah. Yeah.
But nonetheless, the person's being a rule follower somehow depends on his or her membership in a community.
Yeah, or being.
In your book, I recall I looked through what was at the end. I think you added it late in the composition of the book. We'll come back to Robinson Crusoe. Right?
Oh, is that right? Okay, I can't remember.
Well, so, and it's troubling because you think, I think you say something about, we can even in some sense imagine Robinson Crusoe raised by wolves on a desert island. He's a genius, he invents a language for his own purposes, he keeps records, it's helpful to him somehow in, in his agriculture or hunting or whatever he does.
Yeah.
And we think that that should be possible, although maybe no human is actually so brilliant
Yeah.
to do it on his own. And if we want to say that, so you either have to say he's not really following a rule, or somehow his rule following does nonetheless depend on us, with whom he has no interaction. And it's just really not easy to see in what way really his rule following, insofar as there is some, depends on us or our existence, with whom he has no interaction. So if you can clarify what you think, in some way, what you think the dependence of community depends on, what you think the community dependence of community amounts to, and in particular in application to the possibility of Robinson Crusoe, I'd be very grateful.
Oh, okay, well, I don't know whether I have more to say than what I said. Kush does give some exegesis that this is, look, for some reason, at least some interpreters have said that I reject the Crusoe possibility, which of course I don't do, and at least one important pairs, yeah. He says that I think that's impossible, but of course I try to say the opposite. Well, if we think of Crusoe as following rules, we're taking him into our community and applying our criteria for rule following to him. Well, of course, in some way, right? I mean, I've read the objection. Of course, whose criteria are we going to apply to anything, right? Like a mouse, or an animal hunting for something. But here, Kush has got it right. That is, one is sort of taking him into the community, right, and guarding him as part of the community, even though he is physically isolated from us. It's like a sort of social, acceptance, right, when we understand what he is doing well enough. So I don't know if I say enough about this. The falsity of the private model need not mean a physically isolated individual cannot be said to follow rules, rather that an individual considered in isolation, whether or not he is physically isolated, cannot be said to do so. So this is a theory of assertabilities, right? So our community can assert of any individual that he follows the rule if he passes the test for rule following applied to any member of the community. Now, you say that I have some other remark about this? Okay, so that isn't put in at the end. Yeah, I think something was put in at the end, but I just wanted to clarify something, and not that I had not really heard of this before. Okay, well, never mind. Yeah, okay.
Look, he can do, nothing he does depends on our help.
Right. But that's supposed to be true even of individuals in the community, too. Well, they depend on our training, I guess, right? Right. In this case, for some reason, he manages it even though he hasn't been trained. Of course.
What can I infer is being a rule follower isn't dependent on community?
Well, in a sense, it isn't, right? Now,
But in a sense, it is as well, because the fact that you consider him a rule follower depends on your community criteria.
Yeah, and taking him into the community, so to speak, even though he
might be doing something else, even though he might be doing something else, and passing the test just by chance.
Yeah, of course that could be true. Then we would be wrong, right?
But it could be true about the individuals in the community too.
It could be true about the individuals. They sometimes, like this strange person who, for some very large number that we haven't considered, suddenly starts deviating or whatever, right? Yeah, then we say no, what? Yes, right? Yeah. so moved by it, but I'm just wondering what would be going on. I mean, in one sense, of course, we describe in what we find out what water is, right? But in another sense, we better have the concept of water before, right? And that's what the problem is in this case. So what is that we have before, and then decide that, oh, in terms of our psychological or neurophilosophy, it consists in just this, right? And that is, I suppose, what the issue is here, right? So that's what I would tend to reply, right? I never talked about this with Scott. Yeah. And I don't know what he thought would be more.
He's using you to argue
Yes,
against you.
yes, right. He's using me to argue against at least Kripke's Kripkenstein or something, right? Yeah, yeah. But I think anyway, someone who is worried about the skeptical thinks as well, we have to have some idea of water independently of further investigation that decides what it is, right, in that sense, right? And that is what the problem is, what the prior idea is, right? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, could someone argue that it is sort of a natural kind term? That's what the case of water is, right? Supposedly, right?
If I may, yes. I think that's the thought, that meaning is a natural kind of water, and so we just need to do more empirical investigation to discover its microphysical disposition, or physical nature in some sense. And so just what you said about the concept of water versus the concept of meaning. So with some of the things that you say with regard to consciousness in naming in necessity, with regard to the reduction of consciousness to the physical, do you think that some of those comments would apply with regard to meaning as well, in response to this kind of a posteriori move?
I think they might, yeah. Yeah. Of course, you see, many people, before I wrote out that these are all standard cases of contingent identities, I said, no, this will have to be necessary. But we have to see where an appearance of contingency comes from, right? And it's pretty clear what it would come from in the case of water, like there might be some substance that seems to us physically like water, but it's like Putnam's XYZ or whatever, right? See, right, but here, what would be imagining, right, that would appear to be just like meaning addition by plus, or as being an internal state that we are conscious of, right? Yeah. Yeah, some people have, maybe I should just, yeah, that's probably as much as I'm going to be able to say. I should actually read Scott about this. We used to talk a fair amount, and we were neighbors, but I don't know.
Other questions? I have a question then. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think that yesterday, during the discussion of one of the papers, you said something like that while you were writing Naming and Necessity, you weren't thinking about the Wittgensteinian problem, right? And I was curious, what do you think is the relation, if there is any relation, between the picture of reference of Naming and Necessity and the Wittgensteinian problem? I mean, do you think that that picture can survive the Wittgensteinian paradox or not? It has to be reformed in some way?
Yeah, of course, that's part of Scott's trying to use me against myself. But I mean, look, I think in the discussion, I
That-
did
that's
say,
actually the reason
as
why.
opposed to her thing of semantic primitivism, that indeed in naming necessity, though, people often talk of the causal theory of reference, something that term has crept into the book a little bit. It was really because of audience reaction, but I don't really like it, and I would call it the historical chain picture, right, of reference preserving. And I actually say that this isn't a reductive analysis because I assume that we have some notion of intending to preserve the reference, or at least not intending not to preserve the reference and give a new one, right? Right. So I think it is compatible with semantic primitivism, and that might be a moral right, as opposed to a more very skeptical one of the Wittgenstein criticism. Yeah.
Other questions? Andrea and then Chris.
I'd like to work on what with what you were discussing now, and I would like some clarification on this issue. When I read the book for the first time, I discussed it with many people, and some of them told me that maybe the problem of the paradox was due to the fact that you or Wittgenstein or Kripkenstein had in mind sort of mentalistic notion of meaning. The paradox is usually called the paradox of rule following and meaning, as if these two notions were interchangeable somehow. And if the paradox is right, and I think it's right, there is no fact of the matter as to whether I'm following the rule of addition or the rule of addition or any other rule. And if the paradox is right, there is no fact of the matter as to whether I mean addition or addition or any other function. And therefore, there is no fact of the matter as to whether plus means addition or addition or any other function. And these people told me, well, maybe we should abandon the idea that this sort of mentalistic notion of meaning that is sort of assumed at the beginning of the book. And I said, and for example, these people told me, well, Professor Kripke wrote another book in which he told us a very different story of meaning, an externalistic notion of meaning, at least for a certain class of linguistic expressions. And I told them, no, I think that the paradox applies also in this case, because, for example, at the moment of the baptism, there must be something like meaning something by an ostensive gesture or something like that. And so it's really unavoidable, this problem. Or even if we have a very different notion of meaning that is not so mentalistic, then the mind one day or another will come out anyways when we talk about meaning. And I wanted to know if you agree on this.
I think I do agree. I guess, Hillary Putnam, who sort of has been run together with me on many of these issues, and we should be even, right? But he sort of emphasized, meanings ain't in the head or something, but that's an exaggeration, at least as far as my view is concerned, right? Some things might not be in the head, and indeed, it's fairly consonant with the skeptical solution, because my participation in a community is actually very important in naming a necessity too, right? That is the picture that I just do everything in isolation all by myself is not right. However, someone who starts something, of course the picture has to be right for that person, right? Right. And, well, I never thought what the stuff I do in naming necessity might have to do with mathematical terms, actually, right? I'd have to think whether it has anything to do with them, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, we do.
In the book, having criticized straight solutions to the problem of rule following, you introduced the idea of a skeptical solution. And I always took a skeptical solution to be an attempt to explain how we talk about meaning and rule following in a way, and as opposed to an attempt to explain what meaning plus by addition by the plus sign consists in.
Yes, I think that's right.
But then when you go to illustrate what a skeptical solution could look like, you seem to say things like, well, we will declare a person as one who adds and knows how to add, or who understands the plus sign as meaning addition, when he or she passes enough of such tests.
Yeah.
And that seems to invite following response. Oh, you're saying then that a person means addition by the plus sign if and only if he or she passes such and such tests.
But of course,
That could look like a straight solution.
yeah, but of course I deny that in my own.
Well, what I want to understand, how can
But
I understand the skeptical solution in a way that invites this attempt to turn it back into a straight solution?
yeah, well, of course, someone might pass the test and then start behaving bizarrely, and that isn't ruled out, right? So, and yeah, so
Why would it be a straight solution? Because the test would be relative to the community.
Well, it seems to give us necessary and sufficient conditions for interpreting plus as meaning addition. If you actually tell me what the such and such conditions are, and what passing enough of them is, then you give me account of the conditions under which a person means addition by the plus sign.
But that meaning addition by the plus sign will be relative to that community in the tests that community comes up with.
and look, and any number of tests might be passed and then failed, right? After certain, someone says, "Oh, what's happened?" Or, "No, nothing has happened. This is what I meant before," right? Of course, one might say the person has gone mad at that point or something, right?
Used to mean addition by plus, but doesn't
Doesn't anymore, right? That could be one.
Wittgenstein says somewhere understanding is vague. And because how many tests do you have to pass to actually grasp the concept? No.
See, there's another thing you say that is, to me, very suggestive. You say, if we regard a person as, I don't remember exactly how you put it, but I would say, if you regard a person as knowing how to add, then we trust him behind the cash register.
Yeah.
Something like that. And that would be a different kind of skeptical solution. Then you say, talk of rule following, talk of knowing the meaning, plays this status granting role.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to understand. That's the skeptical solution. Understand that status granting role. Then you understand what
Yeah, well, I think that whether or not this might be, I mean, look, that is status getting role. I says probably that kind of thing about the cash register, so on. It's actually based on what Wittgenstein himself says in quite early passages in the book, where someone goes to the grocer and writes, and and they assume, but why does he do this? Who knows? Explanations come to an end. This is right. this is very much like the skeptical solution now. Then we think that the grocer is okay, right? Of course, if the grocer later behaved very strangely, then I guess we have the options of saying, oh, he or she has changed, right? Or maybe she didn't really mean the same thing from the very beginning, right? And, it would be hard to know exactly what to say, right? Yeah.
Remember that passage about the wood logs?
Oh, yeah, that's about the relativism in Wittgenstein. Now where is that? But what is it now? The size of the heap vertically, is it, or what?
Yeah.
It's what?
They put them in a different,
No, so
in a different way, and they charge it according to that. But I don't remember exactly how the example goes. It's about wood.
yeah, and then they say, but look, we just rearranged them, and then you say it costs more, and you say, well, it should cost more, the person in this deviant community says, right? And I think his own view, though not mine, I would say, right, would be, well, after a while, we just have to accept that they are a community with different ideas of when, right? They're the same number of logs, or the heap of the same size, right? I do think, speaking for myself, is one trouble I find with Wittgenstein himself, let alone with my own interpretation of him, but I think he's clearly highly relativistic about some things, right? And of course, some people have said, oh, that's also the same guy whose name not to be mentioned. How could he be an epistemological skeptic? There are two things that are wrong. One is that it's not an epistemological problem that I basically state. But second, if relativism is a form of epistemological skepticism, he is an epistemological skeptic. This same author said, how could the author of Uncertainty be an epistemological skeptic? But in fact, the author of Uncertainty is an epistemological skeptic, right? Right? The witch doctor thing may actually come from a passage in that book that,
It's certainly in some Anscombe writing.
No, Anscombe certainly talks about it, but towards the end of Uncertainty, it says, what about some people who, instead of, I can't remember what it is, instead of relying on physics for this, rely on some, necromancer, witch doctor, something. He says, well, if we want to condemn this, aren't we going outside of our own language game and fighting the other one, right? That's obviously supposed to be impossible or bad, right? Right. And here, everything is highly relativistic, and also it can't be that A, if and only if B for one group, but A, if and only if C for another one. It's something funnier, right? Yeah, right.
Other questions?
Yeah.
You have another one? Go ahead.
I start by reading a passage from the book that puzzled me for a long time.
You got this?
In the context of the
What page?
I hope that this is the same version, 90.
90?
90.
90. It's in the part of the book in which you discuss the skeptical solution, and it's the most exciting moment in which you give the two conditions for
90 or 90?
90.
90.
In which you give the true conditions for sentences that Jones means addition by class, which you call assertability conditions to distinguish with the classic and also truth condition. And you say, from these we can discern rough assertability conditions for such a sentence as Jones means addition by class. Jones is entitled, subject to correction by others, provisionally to say, I know addition by class. Whenever he has the feeling of confidence, now I can go on, that he can give correct, scare quotes, responses in new cases. And he is entitled, again, provisionally and subject to correction by others, to judge a new response to be correct, simply because it is the response is inclined to give. These inclinations, both Jones' general inclination, blah blah blah, are to be regarded as primitive. They are not to be justified in terms of Jones' ability to interpret his own intentions or anything else. But, and here comes the weird stuff, but Smith need not accept Jones' authority on these matters. Smith will judge Jones to mean addition by class only if he judges that Jones' answers to particular addition problems agree with those he is inclined to give. Or, if they occasionally disagree, you can interpret Jones as at least following the proper procedure. Okay, so it seems that you need to distinguish between the first person attribution of meaning and the third person attribution of meaning. And I see why, but not so much. I really don't see the big difference in here, but I guess that there is something going on here that I'm missing, simply missing. So it seems that the truth conditions or the assertability conditions for meaning ascriptions in first person and in third person are completely different. And in first person, they are just random. I mean whatever I mean. I mean what you must trust me. I mean this. I'm entitled to say whatever I want till a certain point at least. Whereas in the third person case, it's slightly different. So I was curious about this.
No, well, that's it. The difference between the first person, that's why I say that the rule cannot be obeyed privately, or we would unable to distinguish between thinking that one is following a rule and really following one, right? But then if the community, they may figure out, oh, he does mean, Jones does mean something, or, but not what we mean, right? Or that we can't make any sense of what Jones is doing at all. In that case, Jones is excluded from the community in this respect, right? Yeah.
I take this to imply this situation, which maybe is exactly what you have in mind. I say, I mean addition by class, trust me. You observe my behaviors with the sign plus, and for some reason you say Andrea means addition by class. But you have a totally different concept of addition because you don't do addition, you do coaddition. Okay? So you say something that false from your point of view, because from your point of view, I do not mean addition by class.
Yeah.
Okay? From my point of view, I do. So there are some situations, maybe this one, or I should think better of it, but still, it is possible that there are situations in which we say the same thing, our utterances express the same propositions, but they have different truth values in my mouth and in your mouth. In the cases of meaning ascriptions.
Yeah, wait a minute.
Meanings to someone else.
Oh, you say they do express the same proposition, or they don't?
They do. The question is, do they express?
Oh, do
Are
they?
they saying the same thing with different truth values because we have different concepts in mind, or we are saying different things?
They utter the same sentences.
They are the same sentences. On your hypothesis, they mean different things, right? Of course, whether we can really distinguish this is part of the skeptical problem, but yeah. If the numbers are too large for us to apply normal tests, right? I mean, you can, of course, in fact, try other things, you know, like what laws does the function satisfy and so on. Now these too might be interpreted in non-standard ways, but eventually, right, people will either come into agreement or they won't. So look, I think I say that if well, yeah, so yeah, so look, if you're putting things in the mentalistic, you know, things that we mean something as a given, right, which is being doubted by the skeptic, right, then yeah, there could be people who meant quaddition. Of course, there are other things that might actually reveal this, right, but you know, eventually there might be some things that just don't differentiate, and we don't think then that there's really something to be differentiated, supposedly, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. But,
Can I ask you a question?
yes, yeah. Now. Okay, yeah.
It's about the machine. No. Part of the view is that for us to be able to say that the machine is computing a function, someone has to have designed it that way. It has to have,
Yes,
it has to be meant to be computing that function.
function, yeah.
And that's why there is no help
Yeah,
with the skeptical solution.
yeah,
That's the argument. That's the main argument.
yeah, I thought. Yeah, where is the machine for that? But I mean, yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, I mean, the problem is Wittgenstein says, you know, we forget about, when you think of a machine, you forget about how the parts might be breaking down or this or that, right? But indeed, someone might have designed it to do that, right? And that might be the intention of what it should compute, right? And so one needs to know some sort of intention. I mean, of course, if we just find such a machine, we might assume after some tests, right, that it's meant to compute this or that, right? Yeah, right. But it's not really part of the physical object itself, right?
Or the program.
Well, the program then is itself like a function, a mathematical, right? Right. Yeah.
Other questions? And you should try to understand everything.
Don't you hear me? No?
They don't hear you. We can't
I
hear you.
was trying then.
At failing.
No, sorry. It means that we are not protected from false agreement. If everything depends on agreement, and yet the contrary view, and this is skepticism, we are never. There are cases where we have false agreement. I was following what was said before. No, isn't that the spirit of what you were saying? Me neither. So
let's see. Question one that sort of assumes what the skeptical solution sort of rejects, that there still is something in everyone's mind and they just happen to agree, right? That could happen, right, given the naive conception. Supposedly, all right, if it did happen in the real world, that is not supposed to be explained by their meaning different things, but by somehow a breakdown, right, in what is normally the case, and that might have normal causal explanations, right, but not a, so to speak, conceptual one, right? Okay, so point two, well, I do say in some footnote, that in some passages Wittgenstein emphasizes the infinity, but then sometimes he even applies it to continuing like the series 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, which is not that, right? And it's really, well, suppose something is in my mind, how is it going to help me in the next case, which I have not thought of, right? And that's a different form of the objection, right?
It's not that, you don't say that you didn't think of it. Maybe you thought about the whole finite list, but when the time to apply it comes, you can reinterpret it.
Yeah, who says, yeah, right, that's right. I mean,
It's footnote 34.
oh God, you know the book by heart?
No, I looked it up yesterday.
Oh, I see, okay. Yeah, look, some passages, and it's certainly helpful, right? The infinity is indeed emphasized, but here, so it's just anyone who claims to have thought of infinitely many cases of the addition table is a liar, right? And then I say some philosophers may think there's some incoherence in supposing that someone has thought of all the cases, and maybe Wittgenstein himself, but I don't need to discuss this, right? It's worth noting, however, that although it's useful following Wittgenstein himself to begin the presentation of the puzzle with the observation that I have thought of only finitely many cases, it appears that explicitly thought of, in principle, this particular ladder can be kicked away. That's from the sort of the end of the Tractatus. Supposing that I explicitly thought of all cases of the addition table, how can this help me answer the question 68 plus 57? Well, looking back over my own Rentricas, I find that I gave myself explicit directions. If you ever ask 68 plus 57, reply 125. Can't the skeptic say that these directions too are to be interpreted in a non-standard way? And then there's something in the remarks on the foundations of mathematics number 3. If I know it in advance, what is this knowledge to me later on? I mean, how do I know actually what to do with this earlier knowledge when the step is actually taken, right? And so I sort of say it would appear that if finite is relevant, it comes more crucially in the fact that justifications must come to an end somewhere than in the fact that I think of only finitely many cases the addition table, even though Wittgenstein stresses both facts. Either fact can be used to develop the skeptical paradox. Sorry. Both are important. So yeah.
Other questions? Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I just have one concluding remark. So in these couple of days,
Yes.
Always with a very, I think, conservative and conservative attitude. And setting the nominalistic tendencies that I share with Jody aside for 1 second, I think you all instantiated